as we usually do. We honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. So who we have with us today, I'm just looking forward to this conversation. And that's exactly what it's going to be. Slightly different than most of our sessions. It's going to be a conversation. And we're opening up the opportunities for you to please have respectful communication in the chat box, ask questions, put the questions in the Q&A box. And at the end, we will read the questions off if we have time allowed. And Scott will respond to those questions. But in the meantime, one of the things that he mentioned to us prior to us opening up the window of opportunities here, he said, as we move through the conversation, that as questions arise, please ask them. Because again, this is a conversation, one that I am so looking forward to. So, what are Jews? What are the Jews? A faith, a people, a nationality? What is anti-Semitism? And why is it still around? A conversation with a regional director of the Anti-Defamation League. Today, our guest speaker will offer an overview on the identity of the Jewish people and explain the definition of anti-Semitism. Our guest will also discuss how this phenomenon manifests itself both in the real world and online, reasons for the concerning trend, and the ways we can all get involved and play a role. Scott Richman, who is our speaker for today, serves as director for the ADL's largest regional office covering New York and New Jersey. He oversees the work of the region, which includes incident response, anti-bias education, as well as legislative initiatives. And he also brings all of this information to light in his weekly national podcast called From the Front Lines. He is an experienced Jewish professional, having served for 10 years at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, aiding in the rebirth of Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. Richman was a practicing attorney and an investment banker before becoming a Jewish professional. He worked at a firm specializing in international law and in public finance at Merrill Lynch. He received an undergraduate degree in finance from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and he earned his law degree from Brooklyn Law School. He subsequently completed an executive certificate program at Columbia University's Business School in Nonprofit Management. And with that, I yield the floor to you, Scott. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Fanny. And really, it's a great honor to be speaking to this group. I have a sort of a varied background, and you're covering all sorts of pieces of it. I'll try to offer some insight, what I think are interesting answers to the questions that you posed. But just to reiterate, for sure, don't wait to ask your question until the end. Feel free to jump in if something is particularly intriguing or surprising, or whatever it is that you want to ask about. So, I'll start with the issue of what are the Jews? I think that is a confusing question. And why is it so confusing? It's confusing because the Jews are a faith, but they're also a people. And there are very few examples in the world of of groups that are both a faith and a people. So, for example, you can be Lutheran, you can be Methodist, you can be Muslim, you can be Buddhist, but you are a people belonging to a certain land. So, if you're Buddhist and you may be Chinese, you may be Lutheran and you may be German, but Jews are Jews. They are both a faith and a people. And there are almost no examples of this in the world. I do a podcast, and I recently interviewed somebody, an expert on this subject, and I asked him, are there other examples of people who are both a faith and a people? And he said to me, the only group or groups that he can think of that have some sort of corollary to this are Native Americans. So, for example, the Sioux have a Sioux faith, and they're a Sioux people. The Cherokee, a Cherokee faith, and they're a people, but really very, very unusual. And the problem, therefore, is that most people don't understand this because they see things through the lens of their own identity. And many people simply view Jews as a faith, but a people are different because a people have a language, they have customs, they have holidays, they have history, they have a homeland. All of these things are attributes of a people, which Jews have, but they're also, of course, a faith, a very ancient faith that has informed other faiths. So that's one fact that's important to know in terms of who the Jews are. Other facts about the Jews. So Jews are not large in number. And indeed, they really don't believe very much in proselytizing, which is part of the reason that they're not large in number. Also, they were persecuted for many years. There are about 13, 14 million Jews in the world. 15, 16, I mean, it depends on how you count who is a Jew, but you're talking about very, very small numbers in comparison to the billions of people around the world. The vast majority of Jews are now located in Israel and the United States. That, of course, was not always the case. That's only been the case for the past few decades. Maybe I'd say 90%, 85% of the Jews in the world are in those two places, and the rest are spread, perhaps in 100 different countries. But for many, many generations, after being exiled from the land of Israel, Jews were prevalent across the Arab world, in places like Iraq, huge Jewish community in Iraq, in places like Morocco and Egypt and countries like that, across Europe, in countries initially, more Western European countries, Spain, England, France, and then being accepted into Eastern European countries, welcomed into East European countries in the Middle Ages because of their abilities with trade, because they had contacts in so many different places, and were welcomed into countries like Poland and what eventually became the Pale of Settlement, a place where Jews traditionally lived, from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They're actually confined there. So a lot of migration of Jews, but as a result, millions of Jews were in these places, and the Holocaust decimated many of those populations. Emigration to Israel, of course, and immigration to the United States around between 1880 and 1920, essentially was the immigration to the United States. So a lot of movement in there. Yes, of course, in Africa as well. So Ethiopian Jews, you may have heard of, a very important community. Most of the Ethiopian Jews have emigrated to Israel, a very small population left in Ethiopia. Certainly a large population in South Africa. These were Jews who emigrated from Lithuania. A few families had emigrated from Lithuania, and that, of course, was very prescient because those Jews who emigrated from Lithuania, that was before World War II, survived the war. Many of those Jews from South Africa have left. They are now in Australia, they're in Israel, they're in the United States. Many of the Jews that were in North African countries, Algeria, in Morocco, Tunisia, they immigrated primarily to French-speaking countries, so to France and to Canada, and of course the Libyan Jews, because that was an Italian colony. They emigrated primarily to Italy and then beyond. So a lot of migration in there, but the bottom line is that now it's fairly well confined to these two major hubs of Jewry, and recently the Jewish population in Israel surpassed the Jewish population in the United States. And that, of course, is a trend that will continue. Israel is a country that has a very high birth rate, one of the highest in the world. It's over 3 children per couple. Very few developed nations that have that kind of birth rate. So that's a trend that, of course, is likely not going to be reversed. So that's a bit of history of the Jews and where the Jews are located and how many there are. Really, very, very few. They tend to have outsized influence. I don't mean to say that as an anti-Semitic trope, but they often end up, very well educated, end up in positions in the government and in media and in different important roles. So that's a bit about who the Jewish people are. Let me talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. And why do I know so much about anti-Semitism? The issue with it, well, let me talk a bit about ADL for a second, because you should know about this organization that I represent. ADL is an organization that was founded in 1913. It was founded basically with one goal in mind: to fight hate, to fight anti-Semitism, and to fight all forms of hate. Very important. We're a Jewish organization, but we are concerned about all forms of hate: racism, Islamophobia, attacks on the LGBTQ plus community, Latinos, etc. Obviously, the wave of Asian violence we've been experiencing. All of that is of concern to ADL, and it has been since we were founded in 1913. We believe deeply that if one minority is being persecuted, if one group is being persecuted, then all can, because there's something wrong with society when they allow their minorities to be persecuted. So we deeply believe that the two are intertwined, and everything we've done in our history has been to both fight anti-Semitism and to fight all forms of social prejudice. With that said, I would say that ADL very much takes the lead when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism, and when it comes to the other forums, there are other organizations, other groups that take the lead, and we play an allyship role. We never want to overstep our bounds, or we play a behind-the-scenes role. For example, in the fight against Asian hate, we've certainly played a very important behind-the-scenes role in helping the Asian community and in speaking out. And certainly with regard to racism and systemic racism, we've been very strong on that issue. But we're talking about the Jews here, we're talking about anti-Semitism. So let me talk a bit about the history of anti-Semitism and how it manifests. Very important. People don't realize that anti-Semitism is not new. In fact, there was anti-Semitism. It wasn't called that. It was just called some sort of prejudice against the Jews or hatred towards the Jews, really since ancient times. And why? Why? Because the Jews were different. In ancient times, Jews were monotheistic. They believed in one God, and that was considered weird, very odd. This was in ancient times, the societies believed in multiple gods. They were polytheistic. And it was simply considered odd. And when somebody is different, we all know when somebody is different, they're ostracized, they're castigated in some way, they're persecuted. And that's essentially what happened to the Jews. Moving forward, they did not accept Christ as the Messiah, Jesus Christ as the Messiah. That was considered odd and different. Then they didn't accept Islam in the many countries in which they lived, where Islam was the dominant religion. So, all of these were cause for Jews to be persecuted. Once they lost their homeland, they were exiled. They were minorities in all of these places, so they were a persecuted minority, and that led, of course, to very difficult situations. So through the years, all of this kind of persecution and being the other, being different, it developed into what we call a series of tropes. This is very important. Anti-Semitism manifests itself in a very particular way. It manifests itself in terms of tropes. And these are essentially conspiracy theories about Jews. And if one wants to understand what anti-Semitism is, if one wants to be an ally to the Jewish community, you have to understand what these tropes are. And what's important to know, these seven clear ways, they are unlike other forms of social prejudice. They don't look like systemic racism. They don't look like attacks on the Asian community. And that's also important to know. Can't always look at things through our own lens, but I'll say more about that in a moment. Let me tell you about these tropes. So the first one is the trope of power. So the trope of power is this idea that Jews are in control. Jews are in control of business, they're in control of media, they're in control of government. You hear it all the time. You even hear it now with regard to Ukraine. There's a lot of rhetoric out there, especially on social media. Jews caused this war. They caused this war because they want to profit from it. That's a common trope that's out there, and this idea that there's a worldwide conspiracy of Jews controlling the banks, controlling all aspects, and that's you may have heard of something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is a notorious forgery that was made in the 1890s by the Russian secret police, and it basically laid out how the Jews are trying to control the world. So, this is a way to other the Jews, to say that they're somehow not worthy, not human, although usually when you have forms of social prejudice like that, it's in an effort to put the other group down, to say that they are somehow not, they're vermin, they're not successful, they're not good in some way. There's a bit of a kind of an opposite effect with anti-Semitism, where it tends to both put the Jew down, but also to elevate the Jew. So on the one hand, Jews are vermin. On the other hand, they're in control. They have the means to influence everything. Very, very ironic the way anti-Semitism manifests itself in that way. But that's the first trope. The second trope is greed or money, somehow being associated with that. This stems from the Middle Ages. It even stems from, being the in the temple with Christ, and the stories of that being the money lenders. All of these stories have evolved into some sort of conspiracy theory about Jews, and here you saw it with Ukraine. The same example of the Jews being in control. Why are they in control? Because they're profiting from the war between Ukraine and Russia. That's why they're fomenting this, because they're profiting financially. You see that on far-right websites. So very, very important, number two. Number three, the third trope is the trope of dual loyalty. Somehow Jews are not loyal to the place where they live, they're loyal to Israel. They're not loyal to the community in which they reside. They're loyal to only the Jewish community. That's a frequent accusation. You have the blood libel. So the blood libel originated in the Middle Ages. It's a particularly heinous accusation that Jews somehow use the blood of non-Jews for their rituals, specifically to make matzah. Here we're coming up on Passover. So that was the accusation, again, to somehow put down the Jew and have them be persecuted. But that has evolved over the years, and it's evolved to become a trope which talks about Jews not treating non-Jews properly. Really very, very ugly kind of trope. The fifth trope is the trope of deicide. So deicide is the charge that I see somebody is not sure if they're in the right Zoom. So yes, this is the child care Zoom, and it's an overview of the Jewish community, an overview of anti-Semitism. The fifth trope is the charge of deicide. Deicide is the charge that Jews are collectively responsible for the killing of Christ. Now that has been reversed. The Pope stood up in 1967 with his Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate was part of it was the declaration that Jews are not collectively responsible for the killing of Christ. You still see it in some places. However, it's largely not a factor anymore, but for thousands of years, it had dominated. It had dominated anti-Semitic speech. Jews would cower in their homes in Eastern Europe when Easter came around, and people came out of church after Easter, all sort of fired up with this rhetoric about how the Jews killed Christ, and they would inflict harm on the Jewish community. That had been for many years a feature of Jewish life, especially in Eastern Europe, in countries like Poland and Lithuania, in other places in Ukraine. The Pale of Settlement, the area that I mentioned earlier. So that's the fifth. The sixth is Holocaust denial or Holocaust revisionism. So this idea that the Holocaust didn't happen, or if it happened, it didn't happen the way that the Jews are claiming, or not as many people were killed, despite the overwhelming evidence that it existed. And you see this now, it had not been around for some time, or not so prevalent, except with countries like Iran pushing it. But with social media, it's gotten renewed fervor. You see many sites now, sites like the Hollow Hoax site on Facebook. You can find this everywhere, with people putting forth fake evidence, saying somehow that it's not as Jews claim it to be. And the seventh is anti-Israelism or anti-Zionism. So here we should make it clear that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism in general. Nothing wrong with criticizing Israel. Nothing wrong with criticizing the United States. Everybody does it, and in many ways, it's considered particularly patriotic to be critical and hold your government, hold your society up to a high standard. The same with Israel, and if you pick up a newspaper in Israel, you will see that nobody's more critical of the state of Israel than Israelis themselves. So we're not talking here about criticism of Israel. We're talking about when that criticism goes beyond mere criticism, but actually rises to the level of anti-Semitism. It's a bit beyond the scope of this talk to talk about when that is the case, but I can very briefly say that it's sort of codified in a definition of anti-Semitism, and the way it's codified is when it somehow invokes the 3 Ds: delegitimization, demonization, and double standard. So when the criticism of Israel somehow talks about how the state has no right to exist, it would be as if you criticized American policy in Afghanistan, and then in the same breath talked about how the US should never have been stolen from the British. The situations are completely different, but it's this idea of delegitimization. Second is demonization, when you not only criticize the state of Israel, but then you begin comparing it to the Nazis or the Holocaust or something like that. And double standard, when you apply a standard to Israel that you wouldn't apply to any other state in the world or any other country in the world. So those are the 7 tropes that make up anti-Semitism. And like I said, they're very, very specific, and they look nothing like other forms of social prejudice, or obviously all forms of social prejudice have things in common where you're othering somebody and you're putting them down. But in the ways that this manifests itself, it's very, very particular. So that's important to know, so that we don't see it through a different lens. So, for example, systemic racism. So systemic racism is a way to it's society keeping a group in society from achieving their potential at its most basic definition. How that manifests itself is another story, but that's systemic racism. Attacks on the Asian community, you saw that with blaming them for COVID. Like, it's very, very different from anti-Semitism and how all of these tropes come into play. And why is that important? Because Jews have been dealing with this for millennia. They understand when something is said that somehow evokes this. And if you want to be an ally to the Jewish community, you also need to understand when the Jewish community is triggered, when these are seen as microaggressions or stereotyping, something that may seem very innocuous, some sort of statement about money or some sort of statement about control may seem very innocuous to those who are not necessarily aware of these tropes. But for the Jewish community who've been dealing with it for so long, they're immediately going to connect it to one of those tropes, immediately going to decide it's anti-Semitism, and immediately be on the lookout for something much worse to be said. So that's the way to really get a handle on anti-Semitism, is to focus in on these tropes and to be cognizant of them. Now, I'm going to move to the next part of my presentation, which is really about anti-Semitism today. Anti-Semitism today is a big issue. That issue is, it's an issue because it's on the rise. Now, it's important to know that anti-Semitism is not a straight line. It does not follow a clear trajectory. So if I think about, for example, especially in this country, if I think about my own personal experience, think about my grandparents. All four of my grandparents were born and raised in Poland. They left Poland, they came to this country because they were experiencing persecution in Poland. They looked for a better life here. But when they came to this country, they heard on the radio the rants of Father Coughlin, anti-Semitic rants on the radio, the proclamations of Henry Ford. There was a sort of understanding that one could be putting down Jews, that one could talk about Jews in terms of these tropes in public spaces, and that was maybe not everywhere considered acceptable, but acceptable enough that these people were not stopped from what they were doing by society. That was the US that they came to. Then I think about my parents. My parents were born in this country, first generation. They grew up in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And when they grew up, they didn't grow up with the kind of rhetoric on the radio. Things had changed. World War II changed a lot of that. Post-Holocaust years certainly changed that. It was certainly unacceptable to speak that way. But there was still anti-Semitism there. Jews were not allowed into many country clubs. There were quotas for Jews in universities. Jews were not allowed at the top of law firms. They were not allowed at the top of businesses, the top management structure. It didn't faze them. I mean, it fazed them, but they created their own law firms. They created their own businesses. They created their own country clubs. By the time I came along, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. And by the time I came along, there weren't really country clubs anymore that didn't allow Jews in. Jews were at the top of law firms. There were no longer quotas for Jews in universities. And I barely thought about anti-Semitism. I grew up in Long Island. I grew up in a fairly Jewish community, but it wouldn't have mattered. There was anti-Semitism, but it was nothing like my parents or grandparents had experienced. And I just assumed that I would be, my kids would be having the same experience that I had growing up in school or on the playground or wherever it happens to be, in university. But that's not the case. My kids are 21 and 24, and they have a totally different experience with regard to anti-Semitism. It is way, way, way more prevalent. Social media has done a lot to proliferate that, but not only social media. And they see it surrounding them. Not all the time, but it's certainly out there. It's talked about constantly, and that was never the way that I was raised. So, what is the situation with regard to anti-Semitism? It's most certainly on the rise, and how do we know that? Because part of ADL's work is incident response. We respond to incidents of anti-Semitism. If any of you encounter anti-Semitism, if any of you see somebody else being the victim of anti-Semitism, if you hear of somebody else, you can report it to ADL, adl.org/report incident, a very simple form, no matter where you are in the country. We have 25 offices. I'm the director of one of those offices, New York and New Jersey, but we have 25 offices. Somebody will get in touch with you and help guide you through it. Maybe you don't know if it's anti-Semitism. Maybe you don't know if it rises to the level of a hate crime and should involve law enforcement. We can help you with all of that. Maybe it's in the workplace. Maybe it's in the university. Maybe it's on social media, and we can help you with all of that. So ADL does this work. Dozens of cases every week are reported to my office, and my staff needs to deal with this. And they're reaching out, they're working with the victim, they're working with law enforcement, they're working with elected officials, they're working with community leaders, faith leaders, ethnic leaders, whoever it happens to be, to deal with the incident in whatever way we can. And once a year, we compile that data. We call it the audit of anti-Semitic incidents. That audit of anti-Semitic incidents is the way we take the temperature for anti-Semitism in this country. It's unique. There's nobody else that's putting out that kind of data. Most people do surveys. They do a survey and they say, are you experiencing anti-Semitism? Are you worried about anti-Semitism? Are you changing your behavior because of it? And they put that information out. We do surveys too, but that's not what this is. This is a look at ADL's day-to-day work, and we've been doing it for 42 years, since 1979. So we have a lot of data to work with. We analyze it in many, many different ways, where it's taken place, what type of act it is, all different ways. And what has it shown? Well, it showed that since 1979, 2019, so 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, was the highest year on record for anti-Semitic incidents in this country, with over 2,100 incidents that ADL verified as anti-Semitic and dealt with. Very important that we verified. We get many more incidents reported to us, but these are the ones that it boiled down, that we had clear evidence that anti-Semitism was the case. 2,100 incidents we responded to. It's a lot. In 2020, the following year, that audit, we expected to come down considerably because of the pandemic, because people were socially distant, they were quarantined, but it barely came down. It came down to about 2,050, a 4% drop. And the reason for that is because so much of it went online. We ended up with a huge jump in harassment cases online, in Zoom bombing of synagogues and synagogue events. That's sort of a quick look at where we are. The 2021 figures are about to come out, and I can't say what they are because they're confidential for now, but they will come out in a few weeks. And when they come out, they're not going to show a substantial drop. If anything, they'll be the same or slightly higher. So if we look at 2013, though, just 7 years before, 8 years before, you're going to see that that number was 700. So essentially, what ADL is dealing with tripled from 2013 to 2020. That's shocking. That's the reality that we live in, and that's sort of the clear quantitative look at anti-Semitism today. More than that, I can say that of the 47 states where ADL has dealt with anti-Semitic incidents, New York is number one. There are more anti-Semitic incidents in New York State, and principally in New York City, than any other state across the country, by far. And New Jersey is number two. And I'm the director for New York and New Jersey. So very large number of incidents. Most states have much, much fewer. There is a correlation between the number of Jews and the number of anti-Semitic incidents, but it's not not only because you don't necessarily need Jews for anti-Semitism. It is part of the reason, though, why New York is #1. So that's sort of the situation. I can answer specific questions related to that. A lot of people ask why now, what's happening? And you could point to a lot of factors. What causes social prejudice? What causes people to engage in hate? And of course, it's not limited to anti-Semitism. Hate in general is on the rise, and you see it with the FBI hate crimes data. So the FBI hate crimes data is sort of the barometer that's looked at for the broader population. And here you see that it's been on the rise for the past few years. The biggest jump, for example, last year was attacks against the African-American community. Biggest percentage jump was attacks against the Asian community. Harassment online. You see harassment online. The biggest victims are the LGBTQ+ community. But you do see within faith-based groups that the Jews and attacks on Jews are far higher than any other faith-based group, much higher than Muslims, much higher than Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, etc. So many people ask why. Why is this the situation? And what I can say is that there are sort of short-term factors, economic fluctuations, COVID, stresses on society that always tend to result in this sort of prejudice coming out. But these are more longer-term phenomena. That politicians come and go, elected officials come and go. These are longer-term phenomena. And I'll point to two things that I think are really important in understanding why the rise in anti-Semitism and really all forms of hate. One of them I already mentioned, and that's social media. So social media is a huge driver of hate in our society. Social media does a lot of good. It's an amazing way for people to communicate. It's an amazing way for people to get their ideas out, for democracy to flourish. You see what's happening with Ukraine, where we're, nothing can be hidden. But it's also a huge driver of hate. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if an individual had hateful ideas in the past, they would need to somehow get those hateful ideas out there, visible in some way. And they may approach a newspaper, they may approach a radio station, they may approach a television station. And more often than not, that entity would say to them, what you're trying to present is beyond the bounds of what we consider acceptable. They would push the hate, literally push the hate to the margins and say, we will not have that on our radio station, on our television station, in our newspaper. That's sort of the way that people used to try to get their ideas out there. But now people have a billion platforms for getting their ideas visible. And now that they have a billion platforms for doing it, they don't have to ask anybody, but they also can find ways to find others who share their hateful views. And even if people don't share their hateful views, they can find ways to radicalize others to share those hateful views. And that's become a huge driver of hate. You may know that social media is not governed by the same laws as traditional media. Traditional media, newspapers, television, radio, they were liable for what was put on their platform. But social media is not liable. That's a law dating back to 1996 when the internet was young, before social media even existed. And that law says that the internet company is not liable for what's put on their site. Nobody wanted to stifle this new medium. But 8 years later, Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook and a whole revolution in social media, which was not anticipated, but we still, in 2022, live with this law on the books. That's something that ADL has played a role in trying to change legislation to not to abolish the law, but to reform it in some way. So there are some regulations. We've also pressed social media companies. These are private companies, and they all have policies about what's allowed on their site and not allowed on their site. And they've come a great distance in the past few years in trying to curb the hate that exists on their site. And by the way, any of you can report a violation. We can get into that later. So that's one reason for the proliferation of hate, and that's been going on not just for the past year or two, but much, much longer. And the second, I would say, is polarization. We live in a very divided society, an increasingly divided society, where people take sides. And when you take sides, you put forth whatever it is that's on your side as being right, and you excuse what's on your side that may not necessarily be so acceptable, but you excuse it because it's on your side, or because you decide to have a win. Only hate on the left can be, only people on the left can control hate on the left, and only people on the right can control hate on the right. And what happens in an increasingly divided society is that the center is weak. It's weak, and it can't push hate to the extremes. Hate begins to come closer and closer to the center because there's not the mechanism to push it to the extremes. So our polarized society has resulted in again, in this proliferation of hate, and it doesn't seem to be abating. And the last point I want to make before I answer some of these questions, which I've seen come in, I apologize, is that ways that we can have an impact on this. So one of them I mentioned before with social media. Social media, we all have a responsibility. A lot of us rail at the hate and misinformation that we see online, but you can report any violation of any social media company's policies: TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, it doesn't matter. They all have policies regarding hate. And all you need to do on Facebook, for example, you click those three dots and you just click the word report, a very simple form. Nobody wants their account suspended. Nobody wants their account revoked. And if they see somebody's paying attention to what they like, comment, share, they're going to think twice about doing it. And they're going to say, is this really true? Should I really be sharing this? So that's one way we can play a role. Another way we can play a role, of course, as I said before, in terms of being an ally, educating ourselves on what is anti-Semitism, who are the Jews, how are they being impacted by this, and playing that allyship role. The third, which I also mentioned, is reporting incidents. If we don't have the data, we don't know what the issue is, and we can't deal with the issue if we don't know what it is. We also do incident response, so we're helping victims through this. That's the third way, and letting people know that this exists is very important. Fourth, I would say, is the bully pulpit. A lot of times there's hate, not just anti-Semitism, but all forms of hate. And we need to press our leaders to speak out. People respect the word of leaders, of elected officials, of heads of a company, of university presidents, whoever it happens to be. And sometimes these things simply slide, or they let somebody else respond to it. But we need to press our leaders to say, this is not acceptable. It's not in accordance with the values of our company, of our university, or whatever the setting of our school. And you need to speak out and let the community know that this is wrong. Now, we have free speech in this country. Quite a number of these incidents are around speech, and they're not illegal. ADL keeps track of all kinds of hate incidents, not just those that rise to the level of a crime. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to involve the police, but it can mean that a leader can say, this is wrong, it's not in accordance with my values, whether or not it's permissible. You can say horrible things to people. You can say horrible things on the street. You can stand up on a street corner and say terrible things about the Jews, and nothing is going to happen from a legal perspective. But somebody can also stand up and say, what you're saying is wrong. It's not appropriate. It's unacceptable. So that's another way that that people can have an impact. I would add just a couple more points in terms of having an impact, and that's this idea of social media. I think a lot of us kind of shy away from social media. We don't want to be involved. We maybe don't want a presence, but counter speech is also very important. It's not just about calling out hate and misinformation, but having a presence on social media where we say this is wrong, and being visible in that way. This is part of what ADL does. I have a big presence on Twitter. ADL has a big presence on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and even just amplifying the kinds of messages, positive messages that we put out there is very important. And the last thing I would say about this is, and it's a bit of what I said before, traditionally you can, one other thing I should mention, and very important for this group, and that's education. So education changes hearts and minds. ADL is a huge provider of anti-bias education in this country. Millions of students a year are touched by our anti-bias education programs. And if any of you want to be connected to those programs, you can go to our webpage, adl.org/education. There are an incredible number of resources on there, resources that are divided elementary school, middle school, and high school, encouraging teachers, encouraging administrators to use this anti-bias curriculum. We have something called table talks, how to have a conversation with young people about racism, how to have a conversation with young people about the election, how to have a conversation with young people about what's happening in Ukraine. It's all on our website. We have a program called No Place for Hate. No Place for Hate can be done at the elementary school, middle school, or high school level. It's a group of parents, teachers, and administrators who come together and engage in anti-hate activities in the schools, and then they receive a designation at the end of the school year that they are a No Place for Hate school. We do anti-bias training in the schools for parents, for teachers, for students. We will send in facilitators for partial day, full day anti-bias training. So also very important. And then that last point I was going to make was just about civil society. So we need to somehow come back to the center. We need to somehow create a way where hate can be pushed to the margins. Civil society is traditionally the way that hate is controlled, not only in this country, but everywhere. And we have moved too far away from that. We need to strengthen the center.
Wow.
Questions?
Wow, that is so wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott. That was very informative. And we have a lot of questions here, so I'm going to
see that. Yes.
You can see them, right?
I can see them. Let me try to answer them one by one.
Sure.
So the first one, can you explain what it means to be Ashkenazi Jewish? Absolutely. So Ashkenaz is the word for Germany. So these were Jews who were either living in Germany or sort of come from German lands. So I mentioned this idea that Jews were welcomed into Eastern Europe. So the migration of Jews was such that they when they were exiled from Israel, they sort of fanned out across the Mediterranean and slowly made their way to Spain and slowly made their way to European countries. Major community in Spain, especially in the Middle Ages, and major community in Germany. In around the 1600s, Jews were welcomed into Poland, again, because of their connections, and they were welcomed by noblemen and protected by those noblemen. That changed with the partition of Poland in the 1790s. Partition, you may know Poland was a country that was divided between the German Empire and the Russian Empire, and Poland as a country ceased to exist for 100 and something years. But the term Ashkenazi refers to those Jews who originated in Germany and then moved to this palace settlement. They are Yiddish speaking primarily, or they were Yiddish speaking, and much of that population is decimated. Yiddish has encountered a revival because of Hasidic Jews, of Jews who are very religious and follow certain sects of Judaism. But that's sort of the term Ashkenazi. And just on the issue of Jewish languages, So Yiddish is a Jewish language because it's a combination of a High German, German from the Middle Ages, and Hebrew, and some other languages mixed in, some Slavic languages. But there are other Jewish languages. There's Ladino, which is a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew, and that comes from the time that Jews were living in Spain. And when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 with the expulsion, they fanned out across Europe and ended up in places like Turkey. They were welcomed by the Ottoman Empire in Amsterdam, and that's how they ended up in the New World, coming from Amsterdam, in Bulgaria and places like that. And those communities, even to this day, still speak, some older people speak Ladino. You have dialects of Arabic and Jewish, especially the Moroccan Jews. You have an Iraqi Jewish language, so also important. Okay, is the dramatic rise connected to reporting of incidents? I will say that ADL plays a big role in pressing people to report incidents, but our analysis of this is that, yes, there is more reporting of incidents, but the incredible jump is not the statistical significance of increased reporting is nothing compared to the incredible jump in these incidents. And it's not just quantity, it's also quality. The past few years, we've seen a huge number of assaults on Jews, especially visibly identifiable Jews, Hasidic Jews in places like Brooklyn. There was just a horrific incident in Lakewood, New Jersey on Friday where a man was stabbed, 21-year-old, and almost died. These types of assaults didn't really exist in the distant past, but the past few years we've seen that. So it's also a sort of qualitative difference. Some of these questions I think are too specific, but I'm happy to answer them offline. Okay, so how does one politely educate somebody about implicit bias? Essentially, you're talking about a trope. And how do you say to somebody that what you've just said may sound okay to you, but to my ears as a Jew, it doesn't sound okay? So that's really the conversation we've been having. It's the conversation about these tropes. It's the conversation about saying, what you've just said is invoking an anti-Semitic trope, is invoking something that has been a cause for persecuting Jews for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it may sound innocuous to you. It may be something that you feel you can excuse away, but to me, it doesn't, because I know that history, and you should not be engaging in these anti-Semitic tropes. It tends to it lets the other person know that it's because they're not aware of something. It may not be their fault, but they have to understand sort of the scope of the world they're entering when they make those kinds of statements.
That may have to be your last question.
Okay.
Because we're like at 12:59. Oh my gosh, this was absolutely the best. It was so informative.
If anybody wants to get in touch with me, by the way, newyork@adl.org. newyork@adl.org is the way to reach my office. And if you have particular questions, particular issues, particular concerns, feel free to reach out. Our ADL website is a wealth of information, adl.org, and specifically adl.org/education for all these resources.
Scott, thank you so very much. This was so informative. I learned so much in this 1 hour from you, and this was very informative. And obviously, the audience feel the same way because of all these thank yous that are popping up in the chat box. So I just want to say thank you again. I want to say thank you to our audience who came and spent this hour with us, because you could have spent this hour anyplace else, but you choose to spend it with us. And for that, we say thank you. And again, Scott, thank you so very much for coming and sharing all of this information with us, and causing me to go back and think about doing some additional reading. And I hope the same with the rest of our audience. So
And we
thank
have
you.
a wonderful confluence with the calendar, with Passover, Easter, and Ramadan all at the same time. It's a once in a decade phenomenon. And I think the calendar is telling us the importance of all living together. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to this group. And thank you all for being on.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you.